Let's get into it now. A spoiler-free review of Mean Girls. It is 2024, and we're still trying to make Mean Girls happen. There were a lot of people a little bit confused about this movie on a couple of things. One is that this movie is a musical. When the trailer came out, it didn't showcase any of the singing and dancing, but it is a musical. I feel like movies are starting to do this a little bit more now because I feel like the perspective I kind of have on musicals of not really enjoying them until there's a really great one is how people feel. There's some hesitancy when it comes to people wanting to go see musicals. So if you can disguise it just a little bit, get people in, sucker, boom, I got your money, sit through this musical. And also that it's not a direct remake of the original movie, which I feel a little bit different now after watching it, but it is a movie adaptation of the musical, which the musical was based on the 2004 movie that Tina Fey wrote. It is that movie adaptation, not a direct sequel, but I feel like they were also kind of lying to us on that. So, first thing I was surprised by walking into the theater, primarily female, which I just thought Mean Girls was a universally loved movie from the 2000s. Male or female, I thought didn't really matter. I know girls in the title, but there was maybe two other guys, maybe three other guys in there. That is fine. But that is kind of the basis of who I'm using the reactions from in the audience on some of the things that I found a little bit cringeworthy. So what you have here in this movie is taking all the same iconic characters and same iconic story, throwing all that into a movie, and then breaking it up with song and dance. Everything that you probably have laughed at in that first 2004 movie is in this one, line for line, which caused some really clunky dialogue, which I just found to be very cringeworthy. And I started to think, why is that? If something that was so funny in the original movie, you do it again, why is it not funny now? And to me, it felt like if I had a favorite comedian and they put out a special on Netflix, I watched that special at least once or twice a week because I love this comedian so much. Then I go see that comedian perform live in town. And instead of doing all new material, they do the same exact special. You know exactly what is coming. And even though it is still funny, it just doesn't really hit. And nobody in the audience was really laughing at all of these lines. You know all the lines from the original movie, and they were doing them again. And it just felt very forced to the point that I thought when they were making this movie, didn't they feel like this wasn't really landing? Or once they started showing it to audiences, did they feel like that was really still connecting with people? However, where this movie did shine was with the singing and dancing. And it took me a little bit to warm up to that because I was so distraught about what was going on with the actual story in the movie. But that is what this movie needed to be. That is where this movie showcased all the things that made it great. You have Renee Rapp, who is also a singer, a great artist. She plays Regina George in this movie, which is Rachel McAdams' character in the original movie, and does a really great job, maybe too good of a job. Because in the first movie, of course, Regina George is the villain, but in this one, it's so much more amplified to the point that I question who would even be friends with this person. I don't really have that feeling from the original movie, but she was so awful and so mean in this movie that I thought this doesn't even really feel believable. But I think they were just trying to turn up that character a little bit more and make her a little bit more hardcore. And Gary Rice, who I primarily know from the Spider-Man movies. She was also in Mayor of Easttown. She plays Katie, which was Lindsay Lohan's character. She was my favorite part about this movie and really was the only actor who didn't just completely replicate their character. She actually brought a whole new perspective on Katie. And to me, that felt that this was the shining star out of this entire movie because it felt like she approached the character a little bit differently and that I wasn't comparing her to Lindsay Lohan at any point because it felt so different. You also have Auli'i Cravalho, who is the voice of Moana, so already a great singer. She played Janice in this movie. She was probably my second favorite actor. By the first act, I was like, oh man, I don't think I'm going to be able to get through this. But it was kind of like when you get into a pool that's entirely too cold and you think, oh man, I have to get out of here. My body is freezing. But you wait a few minutes, you get a little bit more used to it, you wait a little bit longer, and at that point, you're like, oh, it doesn't even feel cold to me anymore. That is how I felt watching this movie, that by the second act, I was into it, and I thought the songs got better and better as the movie went along. I still think the very first Katie song, What Ifs, was probably my favorite and one I would listen to Even outside of being in a movie soundtrack, Revenge Party was also great, and I'd Rather Be Me was probably my third favorite song. And that's even as the music kind of tapers off by the end of the second and the third act and really gets into that story. So the songs were good, which led me to feel that if this movie didn't have to rely on the source material, it would have been a much better movie. Instead of making it the exact same story with the exact same characters, I almost wish they made more of a sequel that was a musical because it would have felt entirely different if they would have been the daughters of everybody who was in the original movie. I think it would have been a much better story. You still could have had a little bit of referencing and the nostalgia that works in there, but it just would have felt a little bit more fresh because they actually did put in new lines that were actually funny and moments that I actually laughed out loud was with the new material. I don't want to spoil it here because if you end up going to see it and I told you the line, then you're not going to laugh at anything in this movie. But that made me feel like, oh, they did put some thought into the writing in this movie and they could have done it. They just chose to really just bring back all of those same lines. So I felt like the movie struggled because it had to incorporate all those moments that they thought people went there to see. But looking around, nobody really resonated with those again because we've seen that movie so many times. We wanted something different, and just making it a musical wasn't enough. The other thing I really wasn't expecting was how kind of poor this movie looked, and it cost twice as much as the original movie to make. But this movie looked like a student film, especially in those first opening scenes when they're at school. And if you take one frame of the original Mean Girls movie, it looks iconic. It looks warm, it looks cinematic. And maybe it's just because people have been posting memes and GIFs from that movie for so long. I just feel like the way that movie was shot looked so much better and so much more refined. This one really felt like it was somebody's college project that they did, and it was just shot on a bunch of digital cameras that had no feel to them. And that is where the movie kind of felt lifeless too. I feel like where they spent all of their money was on the musical numbers, which were more elaborate, more fantasy like, and much more colorful. So it felt like all the budget went into making those moments seem so different that the actual story suffered from that by the way that it looked. And then to top it all off, the thing I always notice is whenever they have a lot of product placement, whether it be the phone that Katie was using, which was a flip phone. Maybe that was also a reference to the 2000s, but it was obviously an ad for that flip phone, which I won't say the name of that phone because then they win. But they also used a concert ticket app that was very apparent that it was a sponsor. There was also a makeup brand in there. They were like, hey, look at this makeup brand. But obviously, you gotta fund the movie. You gotta pay the bills. That stuff is just a part of filmmaking. So can't really hate on them for that. But man, when it's so apparent, it just kind of gets to me. So it would be hypocritical of me to say that this movie shouldn't have been remade. They just keep remaking things. When I myself am a fan of superhero movies, and how many times have they remade Batman that I'm still highly invested in? And I don't think that's really the case here that I'm getting at. It's just they haven't remade Batman where they take every single line, every single action point, and just do it again. So overall, I think the movie was a victim of itself. But I do think if you were a die-hard fan of the original movie and you love musicals, you will enjoy this movie. Even though it'll feel entirely too familiar, there are some great performances, there are some fun moments. But if on the other end, you hate remakes, you hate things that are just a direct copy of what we already know, and things that just feel a little bit cash grabby, you will not enjoy this movie. But overall, for Mean Girls, I give it 3 out of 5 music notes.